A, they have an individual in purple biking at 50 watts for says 2 minutes there, and you'll notice that after about 2 minutes, the oxygen uptake starts to reach a level steady state. And then the individual in the orange graph biked at 100 watts, and there's also a plateau, but there's a plateau at a higher oxygen uptake. So shows that as you're doing harder and harder intensities, there's a greater oxygen demand. But you'll notice that at 250, the blue line, and you compare that to 300 watts, it seems as though the plateau is at the same point, and that indicates that that person has reached their VO2 max, their maximum amount of oxygen uptake that they can generate. And no matter how high the power of that particular biking exercise gets, they're not going to be able to intake any more oxygen. I mean, there are limiting factors like the size of the lungs, the time it takes for an inspiration to occur, the amount of hemoglobin, the partial pressure differences between the gases at the alveolar level, and also at the venous level as carbon dioxide is generated. So there are many different factors potentially, but this graph is indicating that this athlete at 300 watts has reached their VO2 max. Oftentimes, individuals stop the exercise assessment prior to reaching the VO2 max because it's difficult to do. So, rather than measuring a true VO2 max, the highest VO2 that is attained will be the variable that is recorded, and that's known as the peak VO2. When you take a look at graph or at slide 20, figure 5.3b, this is actually a new understanding, or this represents a different understanding of how those VO2 graphs may be. New research suggests that once you get to your steady state, especially at intermediate power loads, there seems to be what's called a VO2 drift, where the VO2 continues to increase slightly as the duration of the exercise continues. This is possibly due to hormone changes and increases and decrease in ventilation rates and things like that. So now we're on slide 21 during maximal aerobic exercise, which is exercise that's greater than 80% of your VO2 max. There's a point where you can't take in any more oxygen, but you need more oxygen to burn the fuel. If that's the case, you've reached the maximum amount of oxygen that you can utilize, and this is called your VO2 max. VO2 max is potentially the single best measurement of aerobic fitness. But VO2 max does not go up in regards to training forever. There's an 8 to 12 week um, time period in which that the VO2 max will increase, but then after 8 to 12 weeks, it will seem to plateau. It seems as though performance will continue to improve after that plateau occurs, but it seems to be that it's due to the fact that the highly trained endurance athlete will be able to work into higher and higher VO2 max training loads. So at first they may be only efficient at 70 to 70% of their VO2 max, but eventually, even though the VO2 max plateaus, they're able to work at 80% workloads, 85% workloads. So the training will still improve, although the VO2 max won't necessarily improve. Figure 5.4 is a graph that represents the VO2 max for an untrained individual compared to a highly trained individual. You'll notice that the peak VO2 max for an untrained individual is about 30 milliliters per kilogram per minute. An individual who is highly trained will have a VO2 max of closer to 60. The highest VO2 max that's ever been recorded for a male is 94 milliliters per kilogram per minute, and for a female is 77 milliliters per kilogram per minute. The units for VO2 max are usually liters per minute, but if you want to compare one person to another person, you have to take into account that a heavier person is going to utilize more oxygen than a lighter person. And I should clarify, an individual that has more fat-free mass will utilize more oxygen than an individual who has less fat-free mass as well. So normalizing that term liters per minute to body weight, where you're going to get milliliters per kilogram per minute, is a better way of comparing different body sizes. Untrained men usually going to have a VO2 max of about 44 to 50 versus untrained women, which is about 38 to 42. And the difference between VO2 max in females is predominantly because females have a lower fat-free mass and less hemoglobin. At maximal anaerobic exercise, we also have to consider that that exercise is neither going to be 100% aerobic, nor is it going to be 100% anaerobic. And the contribution of anaerobic to anaerobic is going to have to do with um, the amount of lactate that is potentially created. Let's see on slide figure 5.5. There are two terms. One is called the oxygen deficit, and the other one is called the EPOC. The oxygen deficit, when you start an exercise, it takes a little bit of time for your lungs and your heart to start beating faster and faster. It's going to take a little bit of time for the oxygen to get from the air into your alveoli, back into that bloodstream, travel through the bloodstream, get to the muscles, get into the mitochondria, break down, and start to create ATP. But I mean, the exercise has already begun. So at the start of exercise, there's going to be a particular amount of oxygen that you need, but you're not able to distribute to your lungs, to your body yet. That's just because your body is in the throes of processing this oxygen. Albeit the oxygen is still needed, if your body cannot produce the oxygen or hasn't delivered the oxygen to the muscles yet, you're in what's called an oxygen deficit. Then you're going to do your bout of exercise. You're potentially going to reach a steady state of oxygen consumption. And then at the end of the exercise, like when you stop running, somebody stops a marathon, the end of they stop and they collapse on the ground, then they're not spending energy anymore. They're on the ground and not spending energy, and that means that there's going to be a drop in the oxygen requirement. But I mean, you've all experienced after a heavy bout of exercise, you still breathe heavy, you're still breathing heavy for 3, 4, 5 minutes. There's still that increased cardiovascular response until you recover, and that post-exercise oxygen consumption is an indicator of the functioning or the efficiency of one's aerobic system. So the longer that particular recovery occurs and the more dramatic that recovery is, potentially the more unfit the individual's cardiovascular, or at least the ability to utilize oxygen, VO2 max, is potentially impacted. Slide 27, there's an animation that explains all of that, so I'm sure you can take a look at it. As you start to as your ability to utilize oxygen wanes, there's going to be more of an increase in lactate, or the production of lactic acid um, through fast glycolysis, rather. So, because of that, as the lactate increases in the blood, the concentration of blood lactate increases, there's going to be a point where you can't get rid of that lactate, and if that's the case, there's going to be a negative impact on the aerobic system. It's a rate limiting factor to the aerobic system. If this is the case, when you reach your lactate threshold, it's an indicator of exercise, endurance exercise potential. On figure 5.6, you'll notice that as an individual runs on the treadmill at a particular kilometers per hour, the blood lactate level in the beginning, when they're running 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, it doesn't appreciably increase that much. That's because as you're generating lactate, your body breathes oxygen, and that lactate can be converted back to converted, or it can be neutralized and excreted. But at some point, your body cannot clear and get rid of the lactate as fast as it's producing the lactate, and that's when you've reached your blood lactate threshold. You'll notice for this individual that's a little bit below 12 kilometers per hour. But for a highly trained aerobic athlete, the blood lactate threshold will shift to the right, so you can do more high intense exercises without necessarily reaching that lactate threshold. So you can utilize lactate threshold as an indicator of better endurance performance. We're on slide 30. For two athletes with the same VO2 max, the higher lactate threshold predicts better performance. It just means that those muscle fibers are going to be fatigued less. They're going to be able to utilize the glucose more effectively. So an individual with a higher lactate threshold is oftentimes a more highly trained endurance athlete. All right, where are we? All right, so let's go to slide 32. As an athlete becomes more skilled, they're going to use less energy, and because of that, their body is going to have to utilize less oxygen. So a higher VO2 max occurs with individuals who are highly trained. An individual can get upwards of 70, 80. The highest VO2 max ever recorded, like I said before, is about 94 for males and 77 for females. One of the things that occurs with practice is that you have an increase in technique. You get better form and utilization of kinetic and conservation of potential energy, and because of that, running economy increases. And when running economy increases, the amount of energy that you need to burn in order for that activity to occur also decreases. So for individuals who are highly trained, VO2 max is going to decrease, but it could decrease because of cardiovascular issues, and it could also decrease because of other kinesthetic or biomechanical issues. There's also a difference with VO2 max given different kinds of exercises, so we would like to be aware of that as well. Slide 33, figure 5.7 shows the difference between a trained runner and an untrained runner in terms of VO2 max, and it seems as though the trained runner is going to start at a higher VO2 max and achieve a higher VO2 max than the untrained runner. On slide 34, successful endurance athletes are successful for a number of reasons. It's not just because of their cardiovascular system. It could be neuromuscular, it could be other factors as well, but typically a high VO2 max, a high lactate threshold, good technique, which is going to lead to very economic movements, and certain percentages of muscle types are going to be common characteristics that make it so that those endurance runners become more effective. So successful endurance athletes usually have variation or high amounts of each of those four traits. That's on slide 34. Certain activities cost different amounts of energy. If you go to calorielab.org, you'll see a list of activities and various energy expenditures. You can use various means of estimating the amount of energy that you're spending, but it's really somewhat difficult to be 100% accurate in estimating the amount of energy that you're spending for a particular exercise, which makes it this energy in and energy out equation is really difficult for us to balance. So if your entire business model is based on that equation, it's going to be somewhat compromised from an internal validity perspective. All right, where are we? I think we can move on to slide 36, and we start the discussion of fatigue. A lot of times people think that fatigue is caused strictly by lactic acid formation, but there are other methods or other reasons for fatigue. Some of them are associated with like substrates. It could be the case that you don't have enough ATP. It could be the case that you have too much ADP and too much phosphocreatine, too much phosphorus, inorganic phosphorus. It could be the case that your central nervous system doesn't have enough glucose and it's getting tired. It could be the case that there's a disruption in the action potential and the release of calcium from sarcomeres and things like that. So, fatigue is usually defined as a reduction in muscular performance that can be reversed by rest. Muscle strains and tears and things like that are reversible by rest as well, but fatigue is specifically not injury related, not micro damage related potentially. There's many different factors that will affect an athlete's performance, such as the type and intensity of the exercise, the muscle fiber types that are utilized, training status, diet, all sorts of things. The four major causes of fatigue are inadequate energy. It's a metabolism related cause. The accumulation of too much ADP and phosphorus, byproducts of the breakdown of ATP. The inability for calcium to be released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum because of a change in pH of the blood, or issues with the neural control of action potentials that are traveling to the motor units because of lack of glucose or lack of fuel. Talk about the first cause is phosphocreatine depletion. It seems as though as an individual exercises, there's an onset of fatigue that is closely correlated with the utilization of phosphocreatine. Um, ATP burns down at a particular rate, but phosphocreatine burns down at a faster rate. So as ATP is burned down, we need to use the phosphocreatine and combine that with ADP to create more ATP. But when the breakdown of ATP is faster than the buildup of ADP, then we can't get enough energy to the muscle fibers and to the sarcomeres for actin and myosin to intertwine, for the myosin crossbridge to change its angle of orientation. So you're not going to be able to make a contraction. So it could be the case that the increase in the free inorganic phosphorus through the bloodstream is a potential cause of fatigue. But it could be the case that also the byproducts of the breakdown of ATP, like inorganic phosphate and accumulation of ADP, is a negative feedback mechanism that is going to allow for the regeneration of ADP and phosphate to become adenosine triphosphate. So it could act as a negative feedback loop, but it seems as though the depletion of phosphocreatine, and the increase of inorganic phosphate might be a potential cause of fatigue. When we're talking about energy systems, it could be the case that glycogen reserves are limited, and upon exercise, especially high intense exercise, there's a depletion in muscle glycogen, and also gluconeogenesis can't keep up with the demands of the muscle activity. So it could be the case that a reduction in muscle glycogen, first of all, actually blood glucose and muscle glycogen is related to total fatigue. With higher intensity, the muscle glycogen is going to deplete faster. So it could be the case higher intense exercise are going to lead to a higher onset or a faster onset of fatigue. You'll notice on figure 5.8 on slide 40 that the muscle glycogen stores continue to decrease, and as the muscle glycogen stores decrease, there's a report or a perceived exertion that increases and gets higher through time. So as exercise time increases and muscle glycogen decreases, the exerciser is noticing a significant increase in the difficulty of the exercise, and that could be a potential indicator that a reduction in muscle glycogen is leading to increase in fatigue. Furthermore, with glycogen depletion, it has to do with the different types of fibers that are recruited and the different percentages of muscle fibers each of the individual athletes has. So type 1 muscle fiber types are going to be recruited first, depending upon the intensity. Low intensity exercise, don't need too many type 2 muscle power fibers. So type 1 muscle fiber types are going to be recruited first. And when they're recruited first, the muscle glycogen is going to be withdrawn from those fiber types first. The more intense the exercise gets, the more type 2 muscle fiber types are recruited for the activity. And then